Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Can you hear me okay? Fantastic. Okay, hello and welcome to our panel, Building Climate Resilience in Humanitarian Contexts. Thank you for joining us. I'm very excited about our excellent panel this morning. I'm Anna Renfrew from Mercy Corps, an organisation working in over 40 countries, addressing conflict, climate change, instability, and helping people survive from humanitarian crises. Climate-related disasters are driving humanitarian needs worldwide, with the greatest impacts already affecting vulnerable and marginalised communities. As an organisation that works across the humanitarian development and peace nexus, Mercy Corps has seen firsthand that the individuals, households and communities we serve live in a complex risk environment, where climate and conflict shocks have strained the humanitarian system to breaking point. This panel event will highlight that despite their complexity and increasingly protracted nature, humanitarian contexts can lay the foundation for long-term climate resilience while meeting immediate needs. Now, without further ado, I'd love to introduce our speakers today. So we are joined firstly by Rina Galani, Assistant Secretary for the Climate Crisis and Coordinator of the El Niño Response. Ms. Galani has more than 25 years of experience in international affairs, including the fields of humanitarian, development and refugee assistance, as well as human rights. She has served with the United Nations in many countries, including Afghanistan, Kenya, Iran, Iraq, and the occupied Palestinian territory. Prior to taking up this position, she served as the United Nations Famine Prevention and Response Coordinator at the Assistant Secretary General level and the Director of Operations and Advocacy for OCHA. Thank you for joining us. Next, we are joined by Jacqueline Muzikwa, Deputy Assistant to the Administrator at USAID's Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance and the US Government Lead for International Disaster Response. Jacqueline's previous roles include Senior Climate Finance Advisor in the Bureau for Resilience, Environment and Food Security, where she led the climate finance portfolio and co-led USAID's task team on access to finance in fragile and conflict-affected states. Thank you. We're also joined by Oxfam's Ashley Thomas, who is a Senior Policy and Programme Advisor. Ashley focuses on international climate finance and climate change impacts, specifically adaptation and loss and damage. Prior to joining Oxfam America's Climate Justice team, Ashley actually worked for Mercy Corps, so nice to see you. Next, we have Anil Pokral, who is the Chief Executive for the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Authority of Nepal, where he leads the government of Nepal's efforts to coordinate disaster risk management and crisis response. In a career spanning more than 2 decades, he has worked extensively on disaster, climate and water issues with Nepali and international NGOs, UN agencies, the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank. He holds a master's from Yale School of Forestry and the Environment, and where he was a Fulbright Scholar. Finally, last but not least, Olga. This is Olga Petroniak, who's Mercy Corps' Senior Director for Resilience in East Africa. Olga is an inclusive, impact-orientated senior leader with over 20 years' experience designing, delivering, and growing high-value, high-impact programming at the intersect of climate change and adaptation, food and water systems, market development, good governance. As our Senior Director for Africa Resilience Programme, she oversees strategy, programme delivery, learning, and thought leadership with respect to climate resilience, food security, and market systems programming. Thank you, Olga. Amazing. So to get us started, I'm going to ask for some opening remarks from Rina. Rina, you recently visited Turkana in Kenya to see some programme locations of implementing partners such as UNICEF, IOM, and Mercy Corps. Can you please share what you saw during these visits and more broadly how the climate crisis is impacting communities with the highest humanitarian needs?
So thank you very much, and thanks to Mercy Corps and my esteemed panelists. We've spent a bit of time together lately. I will start by saying that it's a relief to actually be asked about communities. Wandering the halls here, it is very striking how disconnected we are from what is happening. And it's very worrisome that the political discussions happening are so disconnected. And so let's hope that in the negotiations we do really achieve that ambitious target that we all came here hoping to hear about. But I'm really pleased to talk about the communities because for them, that target is not just a target, it is their life. So I did have the pleasure of visiting Mercy Corps programs. They were partnering with a number of NGOs actually in Turkana as well as the UN. And I'm just going to talk about one individual because then we know that that's millions, she represents millions and millions of people, and then go on to the bigger picture stuff and what I've learned. So we flew in from Nairobi to Turkana. We then drove another 6-7 hours, thanks to my colleagues who insisted I have to go to this particular project, Priscilla. And we drove back 6 or 7 hours, but it was amazing. We went out and there was nothing on the way. We landed in amongst a community that were herders. And those of us in this room know this, but it's really important we keep reminding the politicians in every single event. That community had suffered drought after drought after drought, flooding after flooding after flooding. And they, Helen, this woman, her children, basically had been out of school. The herds had died. We know the story, right? She also did some agriculture, and she spoke about how the map, the agricultural calendar had changed, and she was grappling with how to deal with this. Mercy Corps and partners had gone to what I would call the edge of the earth. It really was, but it's the last mile, and that's one of the discussions that's not happening here at the moment. It's about the communities that are the most vulnerable. They live in an area affected by conflict amongst other herders and across the borders. They were right on the edge in the border with Ethiopia and other locations. And basically, they now had been there, I think, the NGOs and the UN agencies had been there about 3 years. They had been financed by USAID on a multi-year financing stream. And the program actually allowed them to look at, and of course Mercy Corps and others put in some of their own money to allow for the flexibility. They were working on agriculture, climate smart agriculture. They were working on healthcare, water sanitation, and working also on education. And so Helen's life had been transformed in these 3 years. And they intended to roll the program out for another 3, thanks to additional funding that had come in. So let me say that I've met hundreds and hundreds of women like Helen in my journey, and I'm just going to draw out a few of the issues. First, a few of the issues that have come up, and then second, some of the things I think we should be focusing on. So the first, I would say, is, and this room knows that, but it is upon us to say it over and over and over again, that in the fragile context in which we work, the climate crisis is here now. And I've sat in some of the political discussions where they still talk about it as a distant future. And so we just need to keep reminding that we've broken every record. And as politics turns, we're going to have more false news out there. And so it's really incumbent on our advocacy efforts to make sure that we are talking about the Helens of the world and the reality that it's here now in these countries. The second, I would say, and we of course know the most affected countries, so I won't touch on that too much, but looking at it, in the fragile context in which humanitarians work, 1.6 billion people have been impacted by climate, specifically climate, in the last 5 years. And we've seen that's an increase of 35% in the last couple of decades. By 2050, we could be seeing 10 disasters a week. And that is just not something the humanitarian system is going to be able to deal with. It does say something about localization as well, being urgent and pressing, because it is the local actors that are going to be dealing with this. We know that the cost, 70% of those affected are in those, when I say 1.6 billion, 70% are in the most fragile areas. We know that it's multiple overlapping complex challenges. So in the context of Turkana, it was conflict, it was economic shocks. The government there, the local community, the government and the federal government have had some issues around the debt repayments, and therefore it's impacting the money getting to the local level. There are other issues, as we know, as well. And so there's the economic, there's the issue around conflict, and of course the climate. So let me go on to quickly, because I want to hear from the other speakers, very quickly onto some of the things that we need to be focusing on. And I'm going to start with the interconnectedness first. Programs like that are looking at conflict. They had a peace dividend in there. They are looking at climate, and they were also looking at the economic shocks that were being faced and how to combat that with the communities that were being targeted for this program. Too often, we are seeing very siloed programming out there, and we're seeing it in the hallways of high-level discussions, political forums. I think there's been some wins with the Security Council now recognizing the interlink between climate and conflict. That's taken years, though, for many of us who've been working on this. But we are now hearing that at the very high-level forums. I still go to meetings where I'm meeting in the countries with the Minister of Environment, and I actually have to push to say, no, I want to meet with the Minister of Finance, and I want to meet with the Minister of Defense. It is interrelated, and we need to be really conscious that there will be no change unless we work like that. The second point that I would make is that we need to be climate smart ourselves. All too often we have experts on this. What was interesting about the programming that I saw in Turkana was, of course, that climate had been thought throughout, from the start, throughout every intervention. And that is the way of the future. We are going to have to work like that now. And the last point, and then I will talk about financing, the last point is around women. And it's not just rhetoric. We are not going to combat the climate crisis unless we actually seriously have women involved at all levels and target them to lift them out of poverty. If women were targeted, we could lift 150 million people tomorrow out of poverty. I read somewhere, massive numbers of emissions would be reduced. I won't quote because we're still arguing about the numbers ourselves. And then, of course, trillions would be saved in the economy. And so that is the reality. And we really need to be making sure that politicians in their legislation, policies, etc., also take that into account. On the financing, and I've been saying this a fair bit, at the moment there is an estimate of 2.4 trillion required globally to combat climate crisis, mitigation and adaptation. I think for Africa, the target is 1.3 trillion that the African continent has said they need. With regards to financing, we hear all too much about there's too much money going into humanitarian, there's too much money going into ODA, this is like an unachievable number. And what we say to politicians is, well, you spent 7 trillion on subsidies for the fossil fuel industry in 2022. 2 trillion has been spent on defense financing. And the numbers are there, and we can keep talking about the sorts of priorities that the world has made on financing. So 2.4 trillion, or the 1.3 trillion is what I would argue for, plus what is needed in Asia and Latin America, is not out of the realm of possibility. And so let us really, really hope that these discussions come out with an ambitious, courageous target. And I'll just finish with what we all know, but extraordinary times are ahead of us, and that's going to require extraordinary solutions and courageous and bold solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rena. That was a very powerful call to action. And thank you for bringing up some of the linkages and the impossibility of doing this work in silos. Ashley, if I could come to you next, because Oxfam has really led the way in analysing some of the links between climate change and humanitarian crises. What have you found on this front, and what do you think some of the gaps that remain are for understanding this issue?
Thank you so much. And I can hear myself, so I hope you all can hear me as well. Thank you so much for having me here today, and it's a delight to be on this panel. It's such tremendous, tremendous people. Oxfam is a humanitarian and development organization. We focus our advocacy and engagement on ensuring that we are fighting inequality and poverty. And when you're looking at the conversation about inequality and poverty, you are looking at things in an intersectional feminist approach and way. And this is how we can reach those that are most impacted, that are most experiencing environments of vulnerability and instability. And out of that, using this information to better inform and empower the decisions that need to be made to have a great and sustained change. Just to give some numbers, because it really is important to kind of level set sort of the intersectional polycrisis that far too many communities are experiencing. Climate change and conflict affected settings are also humanitarian challenges. These are also the same countries that are deeply, deeply, deeply under-financed and under-resourced. It is looking at sort of the research. The World Bank has found that the 10 countries classified as conflict affected also have, the bottom 25 of them, also have active humanitarian plans, which means that these countries are not only dealing with significant shortfalls in funding for climate action and for climate ambition, but also dealing with significant humanitarian crisis funding as well. This is a terrible platform and place to start, and we're absolutely needing to work to ensure that the financing that is available for both climate action and for humanitarian intervention is accessible, it's available, it's affordable, and it's transparent and reliable. I bring up these, and I'm bringing up the importance of these principles in not only the climate finance perspective, but also in the humanitarian perspective as well, because a vast majority of the assistance that is going to these places that are already dealing with fragility and conflict are going in non-concessional loans that are further indebting people, further indebting communities, and are also not reaching the communities that are most impacted, not reaching women, not reaching those at the front line where it's absolutely necessary. Climate change is a local issue and a global issue, all at once, always. And it's very important that the financing that's available, the financing that is given, does not contribute to additional debt and additional economic stress. It's crucial that these things are front and center. In some of the research that Oxfam has undertaken over decades, but certainly at least in the last year, we've been able to contribute to sort of the conversation about a green bargain that's bringing together climate finance mechanisms and humanitarian financing mechanisms to show that these things are interrelated, intersectional, and also that we're able to sort of see over a history of about 10 years of research the different levers that are necessary for change, the trends that we are seeing and consistently showing up in the different places and contexts that we're working, and also being able to provide suggestion on sort of where and how best to move funds in the most efficient and effective way. I want to draw attention to the COP28 Declaration on the Climate Relief, Recovery, and Peace. This is formally recognizing that the people, communities, and countries threatened by fragility or conflict or facing humanitarian needs are on the front lines of the crisis. And again, recapitulating that they're the least resource to cope and adapt with these stressors. While here, there's a Baku call on climate action for peace, relief, and recovery is using very similar language. These documents would benefit from really concrete proposals on how climate action and humanitarian action could be better collaborative. We can't exist in a silo for these things, and it's important that we try our best to complement, to find cohesiveness, to find policy coherence. It's possible. We've got thousands of people here attending COP. We have representation from over 198 countries. This is a tremendous opportunity to be leveraging great ideas from diverse people, diverse points of entry into the climate conversation, and this all plays a role. We're all on this rock together, so I think we can definitely come together to have better solutions, and to know that community and solidarity is absolutely crucial, to echo a previous panelist. We are the ones that we're waiting for, and the sooner that we are able to work in community and support and empower one another, the better. These negotiations are happening, yes, and they are important, absolutely, but we can't lose sight of the very real realities that people are experiencing every single day, and ensuring that our work is driven by and informed by the people that are most impacted by this crisis. local action is absolutely crucial. And oftentimes, those that are most close to the crisis and issue are those that are most and best equipped for solutions, but just need the support and capacity to be able to do so. And it's also shown, that research has shown that it is also more cost effective to ensure that their local communities are engaged in the decision-making process, planning process, strategic process in all areas to have not only community buy-in, but ensuring community support and engagement. It's not evenly, the climate crisis and the humanitarian crisis is not evenly experienced across gender lines, social, economic lines, looking at things like age, race, gender, class. And the sooner we get to these sensitivities and mainstreaming this thought, the better and the faster and the more efficient and effective way that we're able to create change. The time has passed to say that it's too hard or too time intensive. My grandmother says that I think it's a pound of, prevention is worth, prevention is way, 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 way easy, simpler, smarter, less cost effective, or both cost effective than trying to prevent and prolong an actual cure. So if you can make good decisions and you have the space and opportunity to do that, let's go for it. So that's it.
Thank you, Ashley. That's amazing.
Don't tell my gran I bungled that quote.
I can't think of what it actually is either. So that's fine. Olga, I'd love to come to you next, if that's okay. Climate and conflict shocks have strained the humanitarian system to breaking point. How are you seeing the specific dynamics play out in some of the Mercy Corps programs that you work on?
I'm going to see if this works. Thanks so much for that question. And really, it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you and with this distinguished panelists. So just as background to that question, so Mercy Corps is a multi-mandate organization. So we enable access to and deliver humanitarian aid, economic development, and peace assistance to support communities to meet their range of needs and aspirations, support them to cope, adapt, and thrive over time in the face of global crises, and really build towards a more inclusive and resilient future. And we work with those communities that Rena just spoke about. These are some of the most underserved, most marginalized communities, people who are living or at risk of extreme poverty, and they're the most affected by this global climate crisis, even though they are the least responsible for it. And they bear that disproportional burden. And unfortunately, they've also been least equipped to cope and adapt because the majority of financing does not go to these places. These are fragile places that have only historically received only 2.1% of climate finance. But I wanted to kind of talk about what this plays out like on the ground, and turning your attention to the continent of Africa, which where my work covers. We're really seeing that climate change is driving or exacerbating unprecedented humanitarian needs. And just to look at one particular context in the Horn of Africa, in the past decade, there have been 3 extreme or severe drought events. These are events that historically took place once every 40 years, once every 80 years. In 2011, 2012, I remember working on the drought. 10 million people across the Horn of Africa were affected. In the last drought, 2021 to 2023, it was up to 36 million people. 5 failed consecutive rainy seasons. Imagine if the rain that you depend on for your basic existence, to feed your family, to send your children to school, to help you generate income, is failing you season after season after season. So the climate crisis is really, it's what Rena said, is here, and these communities are facing these humanitarian needs as a result of climate change every day. I also want to emphasize that climate change is combining with other systemic constraints and other fragility factors in this context. So just as an example, if we talk about SDG 2, zero hunger, Africa faces double the food insecurity of the rest of the world, nearly 58%. And we know climate change is a major driver of people being unable to to support the agricultural systems. It's also combines with conflict, and Rena and others spoke about that a little bit as well. When you have fragility factors, weaker institutions, that prevents people from being able to take effective climate action, and it complicates the humanitarian response to these disasters. But importantly, because people are facing these dire circumstances, the grievances against the states are increasing. People are in greater conflict with each other due to resource-based conflict. So climate change is also exacerbating conflict, which then perpetuates and drives humanitarian need. And so really across many countries, I spoke about the Horn of Africa, but really in many countries across the continent, we're finding ourselves in protracted crises that require year-on-year humanitarian assistance. And ironically, I believe last year was the first year where humanitarian funding really went down relative to the need. So I guess the question that we're posing here as a result of that is, so what does this mean for how we do and break ourselves out of these cycles of relief and recovery, and how can financing be more effective? What does this fundamentally mean for how we do humanitarian response, how we break ourselves out of these cycles of relief and recovery? And we're here negotiating upwards of $1 trillion annually to go to these countries, but how can that money be affected if we're continually stuck in these cycles of relief and recovery? And so what I want to share with you is examples of how we've been able to break these cycles by using available resources to simultaneously support adaptation as part of humanitarian response. So using humanitarian response both to meet immediate needs, help people cope with the current crisis, but using that as an opportunity to also drive longer-term adaptation and actually prevent potential maladaptation that is always a risk when people are only thinking about the short term and not the longer term responses. So I wanted to give a quick example of how we build climate resilience and really foster adaptation as part of humanitarian crisis. And we really do that by partnering with communities, local institutions, and the private sector to plan and pre-position for extreme climate events and shocks as part of our longer-term adaptation programming. And we look at where we can leverage partnerships that we have for adaptation to basically drive adaptation through that humanitarian response. And I want to give a couple examples. So I just talked about the last Horn of Africa drought, where we had actually 5 consecutive failed rainy seasons, devastated livelihoods. Again, 36 million people affected. What we were able to do in Ethiopia is leverage a long-term market systems and resilience program and the partnerships there to support people to have cash assistance, but also to access critical inputs to be able to hold on to their assets and to be able to access livestock markets. These are areas where livestock is the foundation of people's livelihoods. So we partnered with 13 traders to conduct early offtake of livestock. We provided a small subsidy, so about $114,000 of our investment catalyzed $1 million of private sector investment in buying livestock early from these communities. This livestock would have otherwise fallen ill, died, and created these communities more vulnerable. We were also able to partner with private veterinary pharmacies, with feed and fodder suppliers, and provide vouchers to communities to have those critical inputs. I think what's really important there is not only did these help people preserve their assets and livelihoods, it kept local economies going and created market-based partnerships that would enable communities to recover from the drought. I'll just provide one more example from Kenya, actually in a program funded by the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, where we had a multi-year development program, but communities were really unable to engage with that program because of these consecutive drought cycles. So we provided food consumption stipends that allowed people to get through that drought, but we didn't stop there. We provided mentorship and business support to those households in the midst of the drought, what that allowed them to do is actually take adaptive measures and build more resilient businesses while the drought was playing out, because they were actually supported to develop their livelihoods in the midst of that crisis. I think the message is that there are creative ways that we can use finance to break out of cycles of humanitarian need and to be able to deliver longer-term adaptation solutions. And it is critical that we pre-position funding and pre-position plans to be able to both deliver more effective humanitarian response, but at the same time, we say at Mercy Corps, a crisis is too good an opportunity to waste to really drive those longer-term adaptation measures through that response. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. Great to have some really concrete examples, and I love that one from Ethiopia. Anil, I'd love to speak to you about your experience with the Nepalese government. So how are national authorities considering the role of climate change in their current and future responses to disasters? What are some of the challenges you're seeing? What are some of the opportunities that you think are there?
Yes, thank you. Am I audible?
You are, yes.
So, first and foremost, I'm really delighted to be part of this distinguished panel, and more importantly, I'm the only male, I guess, in this, which doesn't happen more often back home. Like again, so it's mostly outnumbered by male, but it's really wonderful to kind of be part of this. I head Nepal's National Disaster Risk and Management Authority, which was set up by a law passed by the parliament back in 2017. I happen to be the first CEO, ran it for the last 5 years, and within this last 5 years, I've seen numerous numbers of extreme events that we'd not have experienced in the last 30 years or so. Let's just take the case of this year alone again. We've lost around 600 people in 125 days in the monsoon period itself. 3 signature events, again, that we've experienced this year. We for the first time, again, we started measuring water rainfall some 77 years back. We'd never measured something as high as 624 millimeters overnight. So imagine 624 liters of water on a 1 square meter basket or a vessel. And so that's the amount of rainfall that has happened. So it was kind of raining cats and dogs. And so we're fortunate again that with proper forecasts, we've been able to again communicate this to communities. There's a lot of work around again risk mapping, getting those numbers down to a household level, putting it as a part of a national disaster management information system. Use of new technologies such as sirens, automated, that you could, if I spike it from the national capital, these places would run it in multiple languages of their preferred choices. So a lot of volunteers behind it, pre-positioning. Users of security forces, but also volunteers. So we have a positive story to tell despite the 624 millimeters of rainfall in this particular area. It was a cloudburst. There was 0 casualty in this area. So now if I would again go backwards from 21 years back, even a smaller event like that would have easily wiped out at least 1,000 person in that case. And so this is a quantum jump that we've been able to make it in the last 20 years or so. It's not only because of NDRMA, but also the advancement in, again, observations, climate change observations, for like outlook for weather forecasts, but more importantly, turning those forecasts into more decision, so that we're able to take decisions through, again, impact-based forecasting. So these are some of those early on works that we're able to begin. The second signature event that we've experienced this year during this monsoon was a glacial lake outburst flood. And so a very picturesque village right close by the Mount Everest. There's a glacial lake bursted out. We're fortunate it happened to be in the middle of a day, and so there was no casualties. We had to kind of hurriedly rescue people out of these areas. The children were the first ones to see, including teachers, and so they were the ones who kind of got it out. Had it happened in the middle of the night, we could have lost that entire village, and so there's massive amount of, again, damage and loss. I happened to be there along with the response team. We had to take helicopters to get there. It was sweltering hot, like right in the base of mountains, somewhere around like 4,000 meters. I'd never never experienced such sweltering heat in those areas. That led to the melting of the glaciers, that led to the melting of this permafrost, and so thus these mountains are really kind of showing these changes of the impacts. So we clearly able to attribute that this is because of fast increase of temperature in these areas. We are yet to again begin the reconstruction process. Houses, schools, hydropower projects all been wiped out. The third signature event that we've experienced, and lately at the end cycle of the monsoon, was another extreme event that we'd never experienced in the last 55 years. 360 millimeters of rainfall, again overnight, that happened in the capital district. So we lost almost 50% of the whole death, like something around 250 to be exact, on those 2 nights. And another 18 people are still missing, and so nearly half of the casualties happened to be taken place in those 2 nights. We're able to forecast in advance, but we're not able to really get the impacts right. And so, but also again, we're not able to cater our early warnings messages in the way that it could have been again more effective. And also we've realized that again floods and landslides were mostly kind of experienced in the rural areas, far off remote mountains in these areas. But what we've experienced this year is really dense capital districts and areas such as Kathmandu were hard hit. People were not aware, like again, especially that a mindset that these are only being impacted on the remote areas. And so all these disasters that has led us to massive amount of loss and damage. This is what we're trying to kind of put into papers through a proper assessment as how much is attributable to climate change or not. There's a general tendency of again treating every of these water-induced disasters as climate change. And so we for the first time reached out to look at the climate change attribution behind it, especially looking at again getting the scientific evidence. So we've triggered attribution, especially through world weather attribution. This is an outfit based out of Cambridge, and so they've been able to help us do the scientific evidence and then say that this was largely because of climate change. 10% of the extreme rainfall is clearly attributable to climate change impacts. So this is how we're trying to kind of come up with, again, see how these impacts are kind of worsening every year. Now, what I see is a parallel in Africa and some of these places that you all are working is we're also a country where we went through nearly a decade long of conflict. So much of our male population had to migrate out of the country and like not to be trapped in those conflicts either between the security forces or the warring parties. And so there's a massive, if I may use the word, I don't want to use the word exodus, but also if you look at again, there's hardly like 1 or 2 out of 20 male in these areas. So male population is literally not existent in those mid-hills. So they're mostly in the Middle East. And so this makes us really complicated, especially when it comes to humanitarian response. So imagine half of the force not being there. It's elderly, it's elderly mothers, it's children, the grandparents are there. And so it really makes difficult for us from a response side of things. So this again happened not only after 10 years of conflict, but we've also experienced 3 moderate earthquakes last year. So we've experienced nearly around $600 million worth of damages just last year, and then that right to again. And this year, again, we've lost 25,000 plus houses. So the amount of, again, reconstruction, response, early warning system challenges are multiple folds in these areas. So how we are trying to look at is, again, in addition to, again, like providing search and rescue, humanitarian response, working with multiple partners like Mercy Corps, Oxfam, CARE, Save the Children, and others, and largely through donor finances such as BHA, the USAID, and others, FCDO, and others. Through competitive processes, they get some money. We work together with them. We have mechanisms to coordinate with humanitarian agencies, but also NGOs and INGOs working in this space, but also increasingly with private sector these days. So what we do is we plan for these kind of monsoon seasons based on scenarios, working with hydromet agencies, also regional institutions. So we come up with a forecast. We then have plans for the whole nation. We have plans for the provinces and localize it down to the municipalities. pre-positioning search and rescue supplies, stockpiles in those areas, but also a volunteer management system that is designed across all 4 levels of governance at the local, district, province, and at the national level, all led by the elected chairs, elected mayors in those areas. So that's increasingly a new system that we've come up. So it's more of a systems-based approach of, again, doing humanitarian response rather than, again, being a very reactive, running after disaster events. We've also, again, for the last 3 years, we began, again, a collegium whereby we've been increasingly working on anticipatory action. We've done national dialogues around anticipatory action. This allows us to kind of come together among government agencies, but also NGOs and INGOs with private sector, humanitarian agencies such as OCHA, IFRC, and others. So we sit down together, plan, come up with ideas, especially from learnings from other countries around the world, learn from that, and then churn it out into pilot programs in hotspot basins. So this is how we kind of generally kind of like working on the humanitarian space. So what has really worked out well is a national disaster management information system that's localized down to the municipal level, where we train those people to really get into those data, access some of those loss and damages, contributed to part of a national repository, and then using the science to really look at whether this is climate change induced or not. But again, using the same data platform to again run our other set of initiatives around risk reduction, but also early warning systems. We've just completed, again, drafting a national disaster risk financing strategy. The insurance program, the SOC social protection is another guideline that's going to come out pretty soon. And so we've also, again, as I mentioned, I began with the gender and the social inclusion issue. We've just recently come up with a national strategy whereby we're trying to look into, again, the gender, social inclusion, and disability in all 4 priority pillars of the Sendai framework. So not only for response and humanitarian needs, but also, again, the needs for gender and social inclusion for early warning systems, for say, for instance, for risk financing, for risk reduction. So this is how we're trying to kind of localize these concepts at the municipal level and make these municipal governments as champions and as role examples. So that's the direction that we're trying to kind of take it. One last thing that I want to mention before I end it is we're using this tool called Emergency Preparedness for Response Assessment, EPR assessment, basically trying to ask ourselves a reflective tool whereby we're able to kind of quantify how are we prepared for a large-scale event. And so we've done a EPR score for the national level. So the scores are a bit poor. It's 39 out of 100. And it requires at least another $200 million to get that score to something as a moderate score as high as 60. The resource requirements are massively high. But we've taken this approach of emergency preparedness for response, thanks to also to BHA and a lot of partners in the country. They're trying to localize it at the province and at municipal level. So some of these earthquake-affected areas, we've again used the same EPR assessment tool, and we've come up with this score that's again, it's also frightening, but also it's an eye-opening. The scores are as low as 11 out of 100 for certain municipalities. The average is something around 24 out of 100. So it tells us again, it's frightening, as I said. It also it's an eye-opening for us to really bring in investments, but also technical capacities and a way of again working together in such a high-risk environment. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you. That paints, a really interesting picture, and it's always great to hear someone describe their actions as a quantum leap. That's very positive. So thank you. Jacqueline, I guess a similar question for you, but maybe from the donor side. How are donors like BHA considering, the role of climate change in their current and future responses to disasters?
First of all, thank you to Mercy Kaur, not only for putting this panel together, but also for being a consistent partner with us as we continue to learn, to question, to figure out the best way, not only to provide humanitarian assistance around the world, but also to integrate aspects like climate. Maybe just as a step back, in 2022, we created the current climate strategy that we're working off, and that goes from 2022 to 2030. And part of that climate strategy was really meant to not only force us as an agency as USAID to think through how to better integrate climate into our programming, but also to force us as an agency to be a climate agency. And using that as kind of the starting point of all of our work, whether it's through the humanitarian lens or through the peace and development lens, we look at everything we do through a climate first lens, which I think is a helpful starting point. Having said that, that was just the beginning, and we realized that there were gaps in our own policy frameworks that we also needed to additionally address. Two gaps that I think are important and worth highlighting are one around climate and security. So we have come up with a climate and security policy not only for USAID but across the US government, recognizing that a lot of the challenges that we do end up dealing with also have a security lens. And so it was really important for us to get buy-in from the State Department, Department of Defense, and really come to this from a whole of government approach. The other one that I think is equally important to mention is our locally led humanitarian principles. And that is important for several reasons. I think the stories we've heard today, whether it's of Nepal or Turkana in Kenya, for us was also really important to make sure that we weren't looking at localization outside the context of some of our humanitarian interventions, and really making sure that we understand and continue to pivot and learn as we go into different communities. So this idea of working at the local level and really working through community leadership, working on community visioning, and making sure that we are fully designing and integrating our programming to suit what people need at their most vulnerable of moments, but also we're able to take advantage of times that are less vulnerable to plan for the future, was really important for the work we do. Besides the policy aspect of what we are doing internally, I think it's also important just to kind of reflect on some of what we've learned as an agency. One is that, unfortunately, as has been said, humanitarian funding as well as development funding in many spaces is decreasing. And so acknowledging the fact that money is not guaranteed for us has really forced us to pivot to try to develop additional partnerships, for instance, with the private sector, to think through how we can better leverage, better mobilize climate finance in particular. So as an example, we have set up several blended finance structures, really using our own grant money as a starting point to then attract money from not only the private sector, but also vertical climate funds like the Green Climate Fund, to try and get to countries and local communities that we might not have otherwise within our own humanitarian or climate programming. And so the aspect of partnership with the vertical climate funds is really one pillar that we see as important moving forward in our climate work. In addition to that, I think one area that has been really important has been our partnerships around data. And also how we respond to the information that we are able to get through our various partnerships. On the one hand, we have, for instance, our funding of the UN Early Warning for All, which has been a great partnership across the UN and other NGOs, but also across the United States government, we have the Prepare Initiative, which is the President's initiative focused on resilience and adaptation, really questioning how we across the US government invest in and look at partnerships for adaptation. I think the exciting part about Prepare is that we have been able to bring in the private sector, predominantly US private sector, that is working within the data space, so the likes of Microsoft, Google, to really tap into work that they're already doing, but really zero in on communities that have typically been left behind. So this idea of the last mile and getting data from communities that we haven't otherwise have had data, and then really working on our own programming to make sure that we are able to cater to their needs has been really, really important. I think the last part on partnership, which I think is important to highlight, is the fact, I think just going back to your point, Ashley, we can't do it alone. And so for us, it's kind of been, how do we work with the likes of NOAA, the World Meteorological Organization, UNDRR, IFRC, to really think through and expand specifically within different areas that are reacting to climate, be it flood warnings, be it different weather indicators, and really making sure that we have specialized and specific data to help us be more responsive. We've talked about gender on the panel, which I think is really important and one that we do not lose sight of in our work. In addition to kind of gender as a pillar for us as humanitarians and really staying true to humanitarian principles, we are also very much focused on protection in all of our work and making sure that we come to the work through that lens as well. Another lens that I think is also important to highlight, and really just kind of going back to Rena's point on not losing face of who we are doing this work for, is youth. I cover the continent of Africa, and if you look at the demographics of the continent, it is the youngest continent. And so there is so much that within our program we've realized that we need to start now really better integrating and designing with youth, not only for current programming, but also for future programming. And so to that effect, we have during this COP, which I'm really excited about, we've announced an additional funding amount of $11.8 million, really focused on youth-specific programming, trying to better integrate how youth learn about, integrate access to climate information services, to use that to better prepare within their own specific communities. I think I'll go ahead and sum up by saying we do understand that there is a changing environment. We do understand our own need to be flexible. Sometimes we cannot be as flexible as we want because we are a very large bureaucracy and institution, but we do value conversations like this with partners that continue to nudge us on where we need to improve and use that information over time to be better responsive to the communities that we are working with around the world.
Thank you so much. It's great to hear so many overlapping thoughts from all of your interventions, the importance of inclusion, the importance of climate information being accessible to communities. I've got so many questions, but as we started a wee bit late today, I'm just going to ask one to all of our panelists if they could finish up. So I believe we've already mentioned the Loss and Damage Fund. Ashley, you mentioned the Climate Relief, Recovery and Peace Declaration from last year. Between the establishment of these two pieces, the COP has become a space where issues relevant to humanitarian space have been elevated. What do these commitments, in your opinion, mean for the future of advancing climate action as a central point of humanitarian response? Rena, maybe I'll start with you.
They are significant. So the first thing is, 5 years ago when we would come to COP, it was unheard of to talk about such issues. And the declaration that was hard fought for and won and achieved last year now needs to translate to action on the ground. And I think it has brought some level of moving forward on funding in these contexts. It has acknowledged that more of the big financing has to go there, and we've seen some successes like Somalia, where the Green Climate Fund now has actually allocated a lot of money. We're seeing the World Bank, and President Ajay has been making very loud indications that the bank on its climate financing will also provide more to particularly the fragile context in Africa. So I think the advocacy around these initiatives has been successful, and now it's about translating it in a bigger way on the ground and holding people to account. So the transparent issue that you talked about on funding is key. Right now we are talking about climate financing. It has been very, very difficult to unpack where that financing is going specifically, to who, to which sectors. And so as we look at these declarations, one thing that humanitarians bring to the table is that demand for transparency on financing. We've got it right in the humanitarian sector, we now have to get it right in the climate sector. So it's a good start, but more to be done. And just on the loss and damage, I do want to quickly say that Ibrahima, the new director, has a lot of experience on loss and damage through his work in ARC. And I think now is the time we should be engaging in the discussions on how that fund will function and where that money will go. And we do know it shouldn't go to humanitarians, right? I think we're all united. This has to go to communities and governments right up front.
Thank you.
I think my encouragement push is once again continued dialogue. Continue to highlight what the evolving priorities are with donors and the cross section of donors. It is important for us amongst donors to get together to understand what our own national priorities are, but how best we can lean in. And I think it is dialogues like this that really bring to bear the personal stories of what people are experiencing around the world and why it's important for us to respond. The other aspect, I think, is just better coordination. And so, from our perspective, making sure that whether we are operating at a national level, at a global level, that we are singing from the same hymn sheet and making sure that we are saying the same things to the same leadership so that we can get similar results.
Thank you. Ashley?
Thank you. As was previously mentioned, this is the Finance COP, and I think it is crucial that these conversations are looking at the needs. The needs are evidence-based, that how we are responding is evidence-based, research-based, that we are able to be adaptive in the learnings that we find through our monitoring and evaluating to better be able to channel and finance funding and to ensure that we're getting it to the right places. And I'm very heartened to see that there is understanding that we cannot continue to work in a silo, and coherence and coordination is absolutely crucial. It is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Nice. We
There we
read
go.
it.
And it is absolutely crucial that we start and being able to really be able to finance the support necessary to that and to be able to sequence accordingly. The most important thing that we know we should take away is that this is not a static environment. This is dynamic. The needs will change. The crises will change. We are experiencing hurricanes and floods now that are the most expensive that we've experienced thus far. And that we know that these things are only going to get worse and amplified and continue to disproportionately grow. And so it's important that we try to find opportunities and avenues that are going to enable us to work faster, smarter, being able to leverage the expertise that, again, is around us in these systems where we can talk about anticipatory action, early warning action, the importance of longer-term planning and how that can inform our strategic planning, but also allowing us for the opportunity and space to be able to normalize changing based on new information. And that you can course correct and better and inform our decisions if you are allowing for great data, great monitoring, greater evaluation that can help us continue to transparently show where we are investing and how we're investing, to help to create signals as to where it's necessary to do better and how to do better. And then also, quite frankly, that, again, this is a continuum. And that the longer that we are trying to piecemeal, we're perpetuating an issue. And we don't have time to do that. We have no time to waste. But I am reassured and reaffirmed in this COP experience, and certainly as this conversation and the ways that we're approaching it, that there is a great appetite to work together. And that is a tremendous thing to work with. That is a tremendous place to start, knowing that you are coming to a space with the intention of partnership, collaboration, coordination, and cohesion.
Thank you. Olga and Anil, I hate to rush you, but we are now very over time. But yes, it would be great to hear your thoughts.
I'll be quick, as the elephant in the room is I think that there's a very exciting performance going on outside that's also distracting us a bit. I think there's no question, that humanitarian needs as a result of, climate change or exacerbated by climate change are growing. Adaptation needs are growing. Loss and damage needs are growing. And so I think by broadening these conversations and, the commitments that have recently been made provide broaden the financing landscape and provide us with sort of plug and play tools that can help us meet the full range of community needs and support their adaptation for the future. Because the reality is communities, on the front line of this work don't see, oh, is this a humanitarian pot of money? Is this this climate finance. They have their whole range of needs and aspirations, and it's really on us to put the pieces together and to make sure that, again, their needs are met today and that we secure their future well-being. I would also just add one thing to this. I think it's really important that as we think about these various commitments and financing mechanisms, it's very critical that the money flows not only to those, to the communities, of course, but to those local institutions and partners that are already on the front lines of responding to these to the climate crisis. We're talking about, various solidarity groups, local institutions, local private sector actors that transact with these communities on a daily basis, and then themselves find their own supply chains broken. These are really the first responders and those on the ground that have the ability to help communities, address whatever their needs are today, and also to foster adaptation. And I think we really need to look at how to ensure that, the financing landscape is accountable, transparent, and supports those locally led responses. I mean, I can just give one example again from northern Kenya. We just got a report again of below average rains coming in for Samburu and Turkana County. The good thing is, through our partnerships like with BHA, we've been able to establish better markets for local communities. They're receiving early warning information, and they've just recently sold several thousand goats to have the money early while the prices are still high, and use that to get them through that next season, right? And that's an example of where, these are really, it's that private sector partnership, those local communities, government providing early warning information that really has the ability to enable, early response, early action, but also drive that adaptive behavior. So just a call for locally led solutions and enabling that finance to go there. Thanks.
Thank you. So most of it has already been covered. So I'm trying to kind of cut it short. So the reconstruction and recovery needs for Nepal alone for just this year's damage and loss is more than $1 billion US. I don't know where I'm going to get this money for this, right? And so I can't wait for the loss and damage financing facility to even start trickling, and I'm sure I'm not going to get that full $1 billion out of that, right? And so for us, again, we need to really look at restructuring our own pot of money while establishing systems that would allow us to make a case so that I get more larger pot of money from these likes of facilities such as the Green Climate Change, GCF, the loss and damage, the adaptation fund, and make the best use out of it. So that's a vision. But so in the due process, I see again other smaller pots of money, such as anticipatory action, the Global Seal Program, or even the likes of, again, the BHA support. Like, though it's a multi-year program for the first time being done, it's something of a tune of around $9 to $10 million. So that's a sizable pot of money. So that I need to kind of really start using it judiciously, jointly with other partners, so that I start creating those systems and processes whereby I am able to disperse money to the subsidiary levels, right? So if I'm just right now, I was able to kind of disperse around 43 million Nepali rupees. So instead of, again, we signing the contracts, we send the money directly to those municipal governments. So the municipal governments now, with their capacity and technical assistance, they're able to, again, use this money, disperse it properly. So I have a much larger disbursement portfolio. So these are the kind of systems that we'd want to, again, work it out with. We're increasingly working with, again, youths, very rightly said, again, so having them embedded within those municipal governments, working together. So I think creating these kind of foundations, using our own pot of money, smaller pots of resources, to create an avenue whereby I could draw on larger finances through the loss and damage kind of financing facilities, perhaps the Nepali way of, again, looking at things in such a very financially constrained environment. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We have completely run out of time. Thank you very much to our panelists. Please give them a round of applause for me. They've been fantastic. And thank you very much for joining us.